Welcome back to the Explainer. So, when you hear the word modernity, what actually comes to mind? Industrial Europe? The West, right? Well, today, we're looking at some source material that completely flips that assumption on its head. We're going to analyze how Donghak and Daesun thought completely reconstructed the traditional views of heaven, earth, and humanity to establish a uniquely East Asian autogenous, or self-generated, modernity. We'll trace the evolution of these two pivotal movements and unpack how they literally reimagined reality itself by leaning into these profound concepts of correlative thinking and liminality. Let's dive in. Here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the crisis of modernity, then break down the pillars of Eastern thought. From there, we'll cover Donghak's revolutionary first step, move into Daesun's complete vision, and finally, wrap up with why all of this matters so much today.
All right, part one, the crisis of modernity.
So is Western modernity really the only path forward? I mean, for the longest time, the global assumption has just been a resounding yes. But as we face these massive, unprecedented global crises, everything from climate change to intense social fragmentation, scholars are increasingly pointing out the glaring blind spots in that traditional Western model.
Think about it like this. The traditional Western approach relies heavily on immanence and a substance-centered view. It basically analyzes change by breaking the world down into isolated little boxes, right? Separating the subject from the object, separating humanity from nature. But Eastern correlational thinking, that is attribute-centered. Instead of putting things in boxes, it sees these organic, invisible connections between absolutely everything, specifically the deep harmonizing relationships between heaven, earth, and humanity. It's like a giant web. If one part shifts, the whole entire system feels it. Which brings us to part two, the pillars of Eastern thought. So the first major pillar here is correlative thinking. Imagine a fractal. In a fractal, a pattern just repeats at every single scale, right? It's deeply woven together. Correlative thinking is this relationship-centered worldview that sees everything in the universe as organically interconnected. The source material calls it a kind of stability, which basically means a stable, solid foundation where humanity, the earth beneath our feet, and the cosmos above us are all locked in this continuous mutual exchange. Literally, you cannot affect one without affecting the others.
But the universe isn't just static, right? It changes. And that brings us to our second pillar, liminality. If correlative thinking is that stable web, liminality is the chaotic doorway of change. It's the dynamic space of transition. Think of a literal threshold you have to cross. What happens when the old rules just don't apply anymore, but the new ones haven't actually been written yet? It's messy, it's chaotic, for sure. But this threshold is exactly where opposing elements finally come together and harmonize to create something totally new.
What's genuinely fascinating in the academic source material here is how these two concepts actually interact. By combining that fractal web of correlational reason with the chaotic, messy transition of liminality, East Asian philosophers found a way to bridge traditional Eastern philosophy with modern societal transformation. They didn't just, copy the West. They built a completely new, indigenous modernity from the ground up.
Let's look at how that actually started. In part 3, Donghak's revolutionary first step. The Donghak peasant movement of the late 19th century was an absolute game-changer in Korea. Honestly, historically, it's comparable to the French Revolution. Donghak essentially kick-started this self-generated modernity through a highly chaotic rebellious energy known as jakran, which basically translates to a disruptive upheaval. This messy rebellion acted as that exact threshold, that liminal doorway we were just talking about. It pushed society toward a brand new era by introducing the radical concept of a transcendent heaven that interacted directly with everyday common people.
To do this, Donghak completely rewired the three realms of reality to establish this new worldview. Take heaven, for example. They introduced Sichanju, this incredibly radical idea of holding the heavenly Lord directly within yourself, making the divine deeply, deeply personal. For Earth, they pursued Johajong, aiming for an egalitarian, harmonious order right here on the ground. And for humanity, Youngsibulmong, which is a constant, unforgettable awareness of our human duty. They weren't just sitting around writing philosophy, they were attempting to rewire the cosmos to empower the everyday individual.
However, and this is a big however, Donghak had a major limitation. It provided the crucial spark, sure, but it ended up trapped in short-term liminality. The rebellion was chaotic, it was transformative, but it just couldn't fully stabilize into a lasting system. Ultimately, it hit a brick wall. It couldn't completely overcome the deeply entrenched Confucian constitutional order of that time. So it was a brilliant, but ultimately incomplete, threshold transition. That brings us to part 4, Daesun's complete vision.
Daesun thought represents the ideological evolution that took Donghak's incomplete threshold and finally transformed it into a completed system. Daesun recognized those past historical failures and brought in incredibly profound concepts like divine grievance and mutual saving, which is known as Heiwan Songseng. Just imagine addressing not only human resentment, but the deep-seated resentments in the divine realm too. By doing that, Daesun expanded that correlative thinking into a highly practical, working theology for the modern age.
Look at how Daesun evolved these 3 realms. Heaven shifts to Guchon, which is a paradigm where heaven actually relies on human strength. Earth becomes Chonji Songyershin, physically integrating heaven and earth through sacred text. And humanity? Humanity is given Songsa-jae-in. This right here is the ultimate shift. The success of all worldly and divine affairs is placed squarely, 100%, in human hands. We're no longer just passively observing the cosmos, we are actively steering the ship. When you compare the two side by side, it really becomes clear why scholars call Daesun true Donghak. Where Donghak was this short-term rebellious liminality, Daesun came in and provided the long-term stabilization, the actual reactivation of this autogenous modernity. It successfully integrated Eastern and Western concepts of modernity by bringing yin and yang into harmony, effectively finalizing the blueprint that Donghak had initially sketched out.
Finally, part 5, why this matters today.
The research texts we're examining today make one thing absolutely crystal clear. This isn't just some dusty history lesson. The study of Eastern autogenous modernity offers a thoroughly documented, highly viable alternative to the very systemic models that are frankly failing us today. By shifting from a worldview that isolates problems into those little boxes to one that is organically correlative, we gain entirely new tools. Think about it. When you view the Earth and humanity as intrinsically, undeniably linked, exploiting the environment for short-term gain isn't just bad policy, it's cosmically illogical. This framework offers real, solid philosophical grounding for combating the climate crisis, resolving global conflicts, and providing actual, actionable survival strategies for our modern communities.
So, I want to leave you with this thought. We all face our own moments of chaos, our own liminal thresholds, right? Knowing what you know now about this massive interconnected web of heaven, earth, and humanity, how can you apply correlative thinking to harmonize your own world? Can you step through your own transitions not as isolated random events, but as vital parts of a much larger interconnected balance? It's a completely different way to look at reality. And actually, it might be exactly what our modern world needs. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you in the next one.